All right, so I wanted to start off with a question that I think is probably challenging. Hopefully Jeremy has asked it already. What is professionalism? Go ahead and answer. I'll take the answer.
Acting with integrity.
Integrity is a good. Yep, good.
Working for a mission?
To do something at a higher level.
All right, so the reason I ask is because professionalism is like a buzzword in our culture. It's like the thing, you have to be professional about everything you do. When you run a sports ministry, everything has to be professional, even if you're about playing games and having fun. And but professionalism, or being a professional, isn't really well defined, I wouldn't say. And in fact, I would actually say that there's a lot of relativism in it. Sometimes that's okay, in this case, to be fairly relativistic. So if I came up here in shorts and a tank top, I would be very professional. But I didn't, so. Because that's not what this culture is about. It's more what the culture I come from is about. So anyway, I was just thinking about that. I'm like, well, what is professional? What does it mean to be professional? And in fact, there's been times in running Catholic in all sports where that question has come up, and it's been really frustrating to me, because then it comes back to my mind, was Mother Teresa a professional? Did she run her organization professionally? There was a story that actually sticks in my mind heavily when I think about that question. And don't worry, I'll get into introducing myself more in a minute. But there's a story when she was struggling with the Indian government that they wanted to shut her order down and her work with the poor because their books weren't in order, their accounting records weren't correct. So they worked overtime to try to fix as much as they could with as little money as they could, and then they just put the books on the altar and had adoration and prayed. And they gave them the stamp of approval. So, was it professional? I would say probably not. But that doesn't. But for her culture, for what she did, it is still amazing. It takes nothing away from her that it wasn't done professionally, right? So, just keep that in the back of your mind, because I think that's an important question to continue to ask as you participate in Young Catholic Professionals. What does it mean to really be a professional? What does it mean to elevate the culture to a higher standard, right? To a higher ideal, to a broader mission, as we call it, and to be people of integrity, right? So those are all good. I would say that there's a lot of virtues that can help identify that as something a little bit more solid than just professional, right? So integrity is a great one. That's actually one of the core values we use in Catholic and all sports. So I'm gonna, from there, I'm gonna give a little bit of just a work history, and I'm gonna go through it quickly. And I'm gonna give it quickly because I think some of you will be able to relate just to some of the jobs, and then others you can ask questions later if you want. And I think it'll also show some of the craziness, and I'm going back actually far, so that's okay, because I'm going to go fast. So I started out as a gift wrapper at 14 at Long's Drug Store, which doesn't even exist anymore. And then I became a stock boy. I worked as a mall surveyor. Would you like to take a survey? I did that job. I worked at Chick-fil-A, doing pretty much everything other than management. Then I went to be a dishwasher. That lasted a whole night. That's a tough job. Yeah. Best Buy, I sold computers in high school for a while. Then I worked as a program tester for Agilent, which is basically HP. In college, I worked as a Unix programmer. So, some of you techies know what that is. And then I became a computer tech for a nonprofit and basically rebuilt computers to give to the poor, and also taught classes to underprivileged school kids. Those are college work. It was a beautiful job. Then I became a missionary with Focus for a while. One of the great lessons I learned in Focus, there's many of them actually, it's a huge blessing, but one of them that struck me is to be scandalized by the church. Right? So if you work in ministry, you know what that means. If you haven't worked in ministry, just be prepared, because you have to keep on your mind that the church is a house of sinners. Right? So. And that includes me, so if I've ever pissed you off or done anything, just remember that I'm a sinner too. Right? I don't think you had any questions of that. So then I became an industrial tech. I basically built safety equipment for airline hangars and traveled around the nation installing them. That followed actually after being in seminary for a little while. And then I left that job to go travel Europe for 3 months, or 5 weeks, I was the first one in my family to leave the country, first one to get a passport, and my mom was freaking out. I had a flight that was in and out of London, and no other details for 5 weeks, other than I was backpacking, and I would be in Rome at some point for a papal audience. And in fact, I didn't even make the papal audience. I had tickets to. I went to a different one. So, but there's a story there that I want to share before I move on with the rest of that, and that's when I was backpacking through Europe. I was going on intentionally on a pilgrimage, and so I avoided doing anything that was touristy unless it was associated with the faith. Now that might have been a little strict, but that's just where I was. I wanted to go to honor God in that trip, and so I would go to churches almost exclusively. So, like, for example, I saw the Eiffel Tower, but I saw it from the dome, Sacred Heart Sacre Coeur. So I did also go to the Eiffel Tower because I was walking near there, but I didn't really like hang out at it. But I was traveling through, and as I mentioned, my papal audience time was off, and I was spending some time in Italy. I had a great visit in Italy. I spent about 11 days. I was planning on spending more time in Italy, and I took a train from Loreto, to where I saw the house of Jesus growing up to Padua, where I was going to go to see the Basilica. The Basilica closed 5 minutes after I arrived, so I basically saw it and got kicked out. And I, at this point, in the journey, I had slept in a parking lot in Siena. I had slept on a park bench in Frankfurt. I had slept on the grass near San Michel. And so I had no problems with just being out of the norm on this trip. But I just felt restless in Padua after getting kicked out of the Basilica. And I thought, well, Lord, where do you want me to go? And I contacted the hostel, and they were full. And so I was just thinking, Lord, I'd be fine sleeping on the grass if I felt comfortable, but I just don't feel comfortable. And so then I was just kind of praying and reflecting. I'm like, Lord, I just think I'm restless. I feel like I want to rest in your heart. And that's what I wrote in my journal that night. And then I found a night train going from Venice over back into France. And I was like, well, I didn't really want to go to France this fast, but I suppose I'll go. Venice is only an hour away from Padua. So I did that. And I woke up at like 4 a.m. in South France. I started praying probably 5 or 6 a.m. And then a priest comes in and sits right next to me. I was like, well, this is odd. I don't think I saw any priest at all in the trip so far. This is like 3 weeks into it. Even in Rome, I didn't see a priest next to me. But the priest comes and sits right next to me. I'm like, okay. So, and then and I'm still in prayer, so I'm just praying. And then he opens up his breviary and starts praying. I'm like, oh, he's a faithful priest. This is cool. So then I finish praying, and he finishes praying, and I turn to him and I say, "Parlez-vous anglais?" And he says, "Yes, I speak English." And I'm like, "Great, he speaks English." So we can have a conversation. So I said, so we started talking. He's like, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "I'm just on a pilgrimage." And he's like, "Well, so what are you seeing?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm just going where the Spirit leads me." And he goes, "Then you need to come see me." And he goes, "I'm the pastor at Paray-le-Monier." And if anyone knows what that is where the visions of the Sacred Heart of Jesus occurred. And I couldn't find it on my cheap little map. No, Google did not exist then. And so I couldn't find Paray-le-Monier, but I knew about it. So I went to Paray-le-Monier, taking his directions. Arrived at the sanctuary there, and was greeted by his secretary or whatever, and she couldn't speak English. But I could muster enough to say, Père Edouard, and she called him, and he said, yeah, just tell him to wait. It'll be an hour. I have a meeting. And so I waited an hour. I started looking around, and it was when I was praying and seeing the relics of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque that I recalled last night I was praying that I would be resting in the heart of Jesus, but then I wanted to rest in the heart of Jesus. And here I am, being invited by the priest to rest where the Sacred Heart of Jesus visions occurred. I consider that basically a miracle in my life, the circumstances that happened there. I stayed 3 nights in the priest rectory with those priests that are very hospitable to me. So I still have a very special place in my heart for Paray-le-Monier, and I can't wait to go back someday. All right, so continuing on. Sorry, there's a digression that I felt I needed to take. I came back from that pilgrimage and struggled heavily to find a job. And so the moral of the story here is take that advice that says don't leave a job unless you have another job. Yeah, that's a good one. It took me about 6 months to find a job. I started working at a print shop. So thankfully it was a Christian-owned one. They were nice, and I liked it. And I worked there for a month and then found another job. And the other job I started was as a real estate analyst in the tech center. This job was one of the most interesting first welcomes for a job I had ever taken. There were 13 staff in our department, and when I was hired, there was 12 women and 1 man. And when I showed up for my first day, I met the guy and I said, "I'm so glad that there's another guy here." And he goes, "I'm quitting in a week." I was like, "You can't do that to me. I'm just starting." And so, thankfully, the department was not alone. There was a broker side, and for about 1 week max out of a month, there would be another guy who would come in the office, and he had a cubicle right next to me, and he was a former Bronco wide receiver. So, so the testosterone level went through the roof when he came in, and all the drama was on him. And I got a lot of work done when he was there. So, but there's an important story for this job as a real estate analyst too, and that is that I was able to have an incredible witness in the working environment there, and I'll tell you why. I think primarily it was because I had this beautiful desk crucifix, and I brought it in and I put it on my desk. I would guess if you went shopping for one, you just look for an altar crucifix. That's probably what it was. A seminarian friend gave it to me in the seminary, and this created a lot of drama in that workplace. Thankfully, good drama. Right? One, I had a coworker who had a Mother Teresa picture. We bonded over it, became good friends. Later, her husband hired me for a different job. But there was a woman who had a cubicle across from me who was a Jehovah's Witness. Well, if you know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses, they believe that all images are idols. And so here I was with an idol in my cubicle. And so she was asking our supervisor, I didn't know any of this, but she was asking our supervisor to ask me to take it down because it was offending her. And thankfully there was another woman who was a not very practicing Christian who was studying law and basically told me, "You can't do that. Because he can sue the crap out of you if you do." Right? So anyway, that desk crucifix, Christ created a stumbling block. It still creates a stumbling block. The cross is a stumbling block for the Gentiles, right? And salvation for the Jews. Or the other way around, whatever. You get what I'm saying. So anyway, still a stumbling block for us today. So, but what happened also from that is there was another woman in that department who I would say probably had some mental illness. Definitely had mental illness issues. But part of it stemmed from huge drama that happened in her high school years. And that started to come out, partially because of the crucifix being there. She felt safe. She could talk to me because she was a fallen away Catholic. And this also happened to be the time when Pope John Paul II died. So it was during his death she came and she was just, confessing to me like this was very moving to her. And so I invited her to go back to confession. And she took me up on it. So one day at lunch we went to the seminary and I brought her to the priest who I'm pretty sure was the chief exorcist for our diocese at the time. And they had a great talk for about an hour. Now I have no clue if she got absolution. It's not really my business, but I just sat there and prayed for her. And so what I'm saying is those little things that you do can make a huge witness in the workplace. Setting up the desk crucifix can open the door, especially at a moment of crises. Pre-scandals break out. Guess who's going to get questions? You. Be open. So it's an opportunity for witness. And also great things. Pope Francis dies or he resigns. People will come to you with questions if they know, oh, you're the Catholic guy or the Catholic gal. So you don't have to be an awkward witness. You can just be a silent witness of some sort in the professional environment and still make a difference. And I'm not saying you should just be silent. Anyway, we'll continue on. All right. So from there, I quit and I went back to being a missionary. I was a missionary with Focus. Early on, I was a missionary with Focus. I came back to Focus. That was a very tough decision to go back to Focus, actually. But I was encouraged by my spiritual director to do it. And it was actually quite healing. To some degree, and I can also answer questions about that later. But there was a couple things that I think really, my 3 years in that stint with Focus that really launched me into the ability to continue in ministry. One is, in my first year, one of the key takeaways, we had this fantastic priest who really showed me what it meant to be an affirming man. And that witness was huge for me. Because if you know anything about me, that's probably the thing I struggle with most, is actually just telling people, hey, you're great. And one of the challenges is what is genuine affirmation versus flattery? That's the challenge. Hey, that dress looks nice on you, that can be flattery. But hey, you're doing a fantastic job with this, thank you so much for all your hard work. I can see the sacrifices you made. That's more genuine than, hey, you have a nice dress, right? Or so forth, right? So, Jerry's a cool dude, but that's flattery, that's not affirmation, right? It can be both. So anyway, so that's a struggle that I still struggle with, is how to authentically affirm. And it's also what I recognize is that, especially for women, for daughters who are teens, I think that's critical for their fathers to be affirming. And I think that's also for boys, but I think especially for daughters as teens, I think that there's a lot of trauma that comes from lack of father recognizing their giftedness. So anyway, that was very convicting. Another key takeaway I had from my missionary time in Focus was just the need for community. That it's a community that drives us to transform. When we feel like we belong, it transforms who we are. Because we want to be an active member of community. And the third, probably one of the biggest, toughest lessons to learn, but one of the most crucial, was how important vulnerability is in our lives. For a man, this is very difficult. It's a hard lesson to learn, but an important one. Sometimes we save it for marriage. Hopefully we learn it before. I started to learn that actually through Marked Men for Christ, I would say. That's a retreat in town. Encourage all the guys to go on that. Marked Men for Christ is a non-denominational retreat started by Catholics and mostly run by Catholics. I guess you would call it it's an outreach to non-Catholics. And so they try not to be particularly Catholic, but they do a lot of Catholic symbolism, and you would recognize it going. Father John Lager was a part of starting that. If you know him, he was my spiritual director for a while. It's fantastic. So anyway, on this retreat, it's about taking your wounds and encountering Christ's wounds, and having them. One of the sayings they have on there is, if you don't transform it, you transmit it. Your wounds, you transmit your wounds onto others. And that led me into my third year in Focus of being able to lead a Bible study with college students and being able to be vulnerable. Also coupled with this time, maybe ironically, maybe providentially, my second engagement broke off. Sorry, I take it back. First engagement broke off. I had a second engagement later that broke off. But my first engagement broke up during this time, so it actually allowed me to be more vulnerable because I had a lot of content to share from my heart with these men. And I fell in love with these men, sharing on that level, and I allowed them to open up and feel like they belong. And one of the men in that study, I don't know if his life was transformed, but I believe he'd be happy to say that it made a huge impact on him. It's Father Daniel Chuchi, so some of you know him. He's up in Longmont. If you get a chance to meet him, he is an incredibly vulnerable priest who's just beautiful. So, great man. So those were some of the lessons that ended up leading me in ministry. But then as I left Focus, after that third year, I thought, well, now it's time to prepare for family. Let's get a real career and, maybe work to have some money and prepare for family. So I started working in sales as a salesman, as an account exec for a sign company. This was in 2008, a month before the stock crash. This is a terrible time to be in business-to-business sales. So, but in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, I think the Lord is calling me to start my own business. I just don't know what yet. So let me build up skills. So let's be a salesman. That's a business skill I need to run my own business. Well, anyway, that lasted about a year, and then the company went under, and then I found myself kind of in a I think, hopefully, to some degree or another, a lot of men go through this if they've ever lost a job, of almost an existential crisis. And the existential crisis is men tend to find a lot of identity in their work. And so it was a very good wound to be bringing up, where is my identity? Right? And ultimately, of course, my identity was being found in Christ. And so I had to go through that struggle of, have I lost my value because I have no work, and economy sucks, and am I ever going to find a job, and blah, 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 blah. And during that time, I had a friend who I'd met in Focus, and she was traveling out on a med school rotation, and just happened at a friend's house. Molly O'Brien, some of you know. What's her name, Irene?
She's still Sister Molly. She hasn't taken
Sister Molly.
profession.
There we go.
Oh, yeah?
Hasn't taken a name, but she's now Sister Molly. So this friend happened to be on her couch, and it was just a random encounter at a rosary dinner at her house. And I said, "What are you doing out here? You don't live with her. And how do you even know Molly? She's my friend." And she was on her med school rotation. She said, and then after talking to her a little bit, she said, "Paul, what do you think? Why don't you start like a sports ministry? Kansas has done one. said, no, I don't have any interest in getting back into ministry. I'm working on a career, you know. And then in prayer, within a week, I heard the Lord speak to me, nudge me, saying, Paul, are you willing to be open? I said, all right, Lord. That's all I'm willing to give, though, so I'm just going to be open. And so then I started talking with some other people that were doing similar things around the nation. Talked to a group in Kansas City who still runs an apostle similar there to us out there. And after a month of talking with them and them telling me, hey, you know, we want to help other groups start, I'm like, great, send me something, help me start. I don't know how I've played in 3 rec leagues my entire life. How do I do this? And after a month, I got a 3-page vision document. And I said, guys, you already shared all this over the phone with me. The only thing I learned from this is you don't allow alcohol while people are playing. I'm like, this doesn't help me. I don't know what to do here. And so then I said, I need something more, like, you know, a manual. A, B, C, what do I do first? And after a month of waiting, they didn't have anything, so I said, okay, great, I'm just going to do this on my own. And so I decided to try. I wasn't committed still. I was like, Lord, we'll just see. I put a blurb in the Denver Catholic, which was called the Catholic Register back then. And so there's a little blurb, and I'm like, I don't even know if young adults read that, but whatever. Just put a little blurb in. And then we had a post on Facebook groups, back when Facebook groups actually worked to get messages out. And so we had a post on Facebook group, that post in the Catholic Register, and that was it for our marketing. We had 150 young adults come out for our first kickball league. And midway through that season, my spiritual director at the time said, Paul, I think you found your calling. And then he goes, how long can you last without income? Here I am unemployed, you're asking me how long I can last without income. Right? Thankfully, I did have some savings, so I was able to last without income. And so we did a softball tournament, or softball league, and we did flag football league, and we did dodgeball, and we did a lot of different sports this time. And we got our 501c3 approval, and I started fundraising, and I pulled my first paycheck 6 months later, $500, covered my rent. So in the first year, I think I made $6,000, and Catholic Young Sports is still here, which is probably a miracle in itself. There were about 3 times in Catholic Young Sports history where I thought, I should shut this down. There's no reason I should be doing this. This is crazy. Almost all of them had to do when money was tight. And particularly when I was struggling, particularly when I was getting married, I was thinking, am I going to be able to provide for family and whatnot. Right? So now there are a lot of challenges in Catholic Young Sports along that way that I would love to cover, but I don't think I'm going to have time to. So I want to talk about three things here before I'm going to try to do it in 5 minutes-ish. One is, I'm going to start with Acts 2:42. When I was starting Catholic Young Sports, this verse stuck out to me heavily. They adhered to the teachings of the apostles. They prayed together. They had a communal life, and they broke the daily bread. That's paraphrasing. As I'm a Catholic, I can't memorize verses very well. And but those are the 4 what the early church recognizes, or what theologians would recognize almost as the early 4 pillars of the church. 4 pillars of the early church. Acts 2:42. This is right after the resurrection, and there's 4 main things: the daily bread, the daily mass, the communal life, the teaching of the apostles, and the daily prayers, liturgy of the hours. And I was teaching a 4th grade CCD at the time, and I thought to myself, we still have 3 out of those 4, but our community sucks. And at that time, the only young adult ministry in Denver was Theology on Tap, 9 months out of the year. And if you had gone to Theology on Tap back then, it was not a hospitable environment. What I mean by that is you would go with your 4 friends, and if you didn't go with friends, you sat alone. Because it was so packed, you couldn't get anywhere, you couldn't move anywhere, and you'd be standing in the back with strangers. And there was no hospitality group, there was no welcome committee. It was just show up for this talk. But it was all that was going on. Right? There wasn't an intentionality that it was broken, but there was no intentionality, almost period, in Theology on Tap at the time. I hear it's much better. I don't get to go as much with the young kids, but I hear it's much better now, and I trust that it is. So, and I've been maybe to 1, and I can tell you that even the space is better. So this was the environment that I started Catholic Young Sports in, and I thought, the quote from Mother Teresa, in Calcutta we have leprosy, but in the West there is loneliness. and I consider this worse than the poverty in India. And that was my experience. That's where Catholic Yale Sports came out of, is my loneliness. My heart of loneliness as a young adult. Not just vocational loneliness, but how do I have friends? And this is coming out of my time in Focus, where I had a large portion of friends. But once I left, they were busy with Focus. Right? And I was from Colorado. And I would still go to Theology in Tech and be lonely. Right? And so that's where, that was some of the heart of, like, well, we need better community. And we need to break down these bunkers of Catholic ministry, where people just identify with one ministry instead of being involved in many. And thanks be to God, it kept going, because now it's great to have ministries like YCP here, Creatio, and I hear about a new one about every 3 or 4 months. So this is trying to start up SJI, St. John's Institute, recently moved in, which is fantastic. We office with them, so I'm biased, but they're great. Things I'm going to cover as fast as I can is some key takeaways. One, our faith gives us a greater common mission that we're all called to. If someone could summarize the mission of the church, how would they summarize it? This is a good question. What is the primary mission of the Catholic Church?
Save souls.
Yep. All the same. To evangelize, to share the love of God with others. Right? To evangelize. We're all called to the primary mission of the faith. To be evangelists. To the degree in which we can. To share it with our friends, our family. To preach the good news. Right? Even when inconvenient. Right? God calls us to detachment. To be willing to sell all that we have and give it to the greater call and trust in God. Call the story of the rich young man. You live in America. I live in America. We're in the top 10% of the wealth in the world, no matter where you're at. You could be one of the poorest members in the United States and still be in the top 10% of the world. Right? So we're called to be completely detached from our wealth and be willing to give it all up for Him. So, and 3 is all work, whatever industry you work in, is a process of building community. So, 1, if you're in product sales, you have customers, you have coworkers. There's 2 levels of community, at least. In almost every organization, there's usually at least 2 levels of community. Right? So work is, I would actually say and argue that work itself is a sacramental. It itself is sanctifying and could and should be sacred if we treat it as such. Right? If nothing else, it's for our sanctification through the struggles. I have more I want to share, but I won't. So, let me give you. I'll close with a couple suggestions. Just do one thing to try to strive to build these 3. Right? Let me cover the 3 again quickly. Our faith gives us a greater common mission, which is evangelization. So, no matter who you work for, you have a mission higher than what you work for. Unless you work for the church, then hopefully that permeates what you do. Right? God calls us to detachment, so be willing to be detached from your job, to be detached from your work. If you lose your work, don't lose heart. God still has a plan for you. And all work is a process of building community. If you want just a little nugget that kind of ties back, if you want to work in building community, you start with vulnerability. By being vulnerable, and that's why I started with my testimony, I'm willing to be vulnerable with you, is because the way for you to come to get to know someone, the way for you to become intimate with someone is through vulnerability. So without vulnerability, there is no intimacy. Without intimacy, there is no community. And so if you're not in one of our Bible studies, that's kind of what we really go off in the Bible studies. We won't teach you to be theologians. We'll teach you to share your heart. So. And if you don't learn that, then talk to me, because I need to talk to leaders. All right. So back to some encouragement. 1, if you don't already have a prayer life, right, because we need to learn to be intimate with God, because when those struggles come, I mentioned I was engaged twice before I got married, so 3rd time's the charm. When those struggles come, and they will happen to us all in some form or another, if we aren't able to be vulnerable with God, we will not be able to appropriately be vulnerable with others. And what I mean by appropriate is, especially in my relationship with Molly, I have no business being intimately vulnerable with another woman. So I won't. Because that would be me being unfaithful to her. Because I have to respect the heart that we have. But I can be vulnerable with men all day long, so if you're in my Bible study, you know I will be. Right? But we need to learn to be vulnerable with God. So he's a great practicing ground. And he will also prick you at times and say, no, there, talking about that wound right there. What's that about? Right? And then help you heal it. 2, if you don't already tithe, increase it or do it. Start it. Why? Because we're called to detachment, to sell all that we have and follow the mission. Now, God may not be calling you directly to sell everything you have right now. He may actually be calling you on the mission you're on in your workplace. But if you aren't detached from your wealth, it will own you, and you will find yourself worshiping mammon, right, that God warns us about. So as soon as you can, I encourage you, this is a lesson from my own life, tithe. However you want to tithe. If you need to, if in order for you to feel better about it, tithe the ministries like YCP and Creatio because they serve you, then do it. If you want to serve the diocese, or tithe to the diocese, the Archbishop Catholic Affiliate or Parish, do it. I would argue that the Humane Society is not a tithe. So they don't serve evangelization purposes. That doesn't mean don't give to them. If you care about that, give to them. But don't consider that tithe. So try to work on your tithe if you don't already do it. Tithe is 10%. It does come from the Old Testament. Also encourage you to volunteer your talents, time, talent, treasure, with some type of religious organization or something. Try to find some type of leadership role to develop yourself. Right? If you can. I can tell you that from working with volunteers, it is more difficult to lead and manage volunteers than it is staff. Why? Because it's really hard as a leader to set a vision for a volunteer, and then when they drop the ball, say, you suck. But with staff, you can say, I'm writing you up. Because there's real accountability, right? You're paid. I sign the paycheck of our staff. They have real accountability. They follow through with their commitments. Volunteers struggle with that, but I would also argue that the struggle is more mine on setting clear vision for what your role as a volunteer, and that's very difficult. So that's why it's important to find leaders in volunteer roles that can actually take a vision and say, I can run with this. I can own this. That would also be my encouragement in your jobs, is to own your jobs as if you own the company. Right? So, all right. So we can go more into that. And then third, be bold. So shake yourself from your comfort zones. Take those challenges of putting that desk crucifix on. Put on a beautiful picture of Mother Teresa. Do something that just steps you out of your comfort zone a little bit in your work environment. Maybe you just put up on the break room bulletin board, Bible study Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. And maybe you show up and be the only one for 5 months in a row. And that's okay. Take it as your prayer time. But when that one person comes in and says, I saw this posted, and I just thought, well, maybe I'd finally show up. Great. Do a Bible study with that. Don't know how to lead a Bible study? We'll come teach you. Come to Academy on Sports Bible, we'll teach you. You'll learn from us. Right? So find ways to make yourself aware. Be bold and shake yourself from that